There was nothing much for teenagers to do in Wisconsin, so we used to pile into each other's cars and go driving in the evenings. Sometimes we played hide and seek. One car had a 10-minute head start to hide, and we timed how long it took the other car to find us. This was no mean task, as the network of little roads and lanes leading up to farmland is endless in this part of the world. On Midsummer's Eve 1998, it had been our turn to hide. There were 5 of us in the car altogether, and I was in the front passenger seat. We had found a brilliant hiding place by reversing up a long, winding track, wide enough for only one vehicle. With the lights turned off, we were undetectable from the road. Once our eyes became accustomed, we could easily see our surroundings in the moonlight. After about 2 minutes listening to the dulcet tones of The Cure, an almost overwhelming feeling of eeriness seemed to take over everyone at once, accompanied by a thumping sound and vibrations of heavy footfalls coming from behind us. The driver needed little persuading to get out of there fast. As soon as the car was moving, my friends in the back seat started yelling that they could see something following us in the field beyond the hedge on the passenger side. We frantically rolled up all the open windows. It then overtook the passenger window and was level with the bonnet. It must have been running at 30 miles per hour at least to keep up with us. I can only describe what I saw as a very tall humanoid. It ran, or rather loped, on muscular legs, which we could see through the sparse hedge. It had odd, elongated facial features from the side, almost like a jackrabbit with horns. Its chest, arms, and torso were clearly visible, as it was at least 90 centimeters taller than the hedge, which we later estimated was at least 1.5 meters high. It was covered with what looked like very coarse, shaggy, sandy-colored hair. As it ran level with the bonnet for about 30 seconds, it turned its head as if to look directly in the car, and I got a full view of its face. It was goat-like, with 2 horns, a long face, and black, expressionless eyes on either side of its head. We were all mesmerized and couldn't look away. I don't know how my friend managed to keep driving. The creature then headed away from the car, across the field and out of sight. It was definitely on 2 legs, not 4, and the muscular hindquarters ended in slim ankles with hooves. When we finally reached the end of the track, we encountered a ram with full horns standing in the middle of the road as we turned into it. Its eyes seemed to glow malevolently in the headlights. Thoroughly unnerved, we drove straight home. There was definitely something otherworldly about the creature we had seen. We still talk about it when we meet up. My friends, obviously swayed by the fact that it happened on Midsummer Night, still maintain it was the God Pan, or one of his variations, but I have other ideas. Could it have been a demon, or even Lucifer himself? I later learned that at the time of the sighting, there was a dark magic circle operating in the area. Perhaps they were dabbling in invocations, unaware of what they were summoning up.
In the summer of 1980, I started seeing a strange little guy at the bus stop in Calgary on weekday mornings. His skin, eyes, and hair all looked artificial. He had a gray suit and briefcase for that totally normal look, and always stared at the paper. He never made a sound, never looked up. His eyes never scanned the page or blinked. He never turned the page. He got on the bus with me and stayed on till after my stop. I kept thinking he looked just like something disguised as a human being. This went on exactly the same every day for a few days. Then one day he wasn't there, but he got on at the next stop round the corner, so I figured he was running late and would have missed the earlier stop, and probably lived close to both of them. Next day he was back at my stop again, got on with me, and then at the next stop round the corner, another guy got on who looked exactly, and I mean exactly, like him. They both stared at their papers, neither one acknowledging the other's presence in any way. No one else on the bus appeared to notice that there were 2 absolutely identical guys on board with them. It was as if I was the only one who could see, or the only one who wasn't in on it. Then a few stops down the main road, they both got off the same bus stop at the same time, neither looking at each other, nobody on the bus giving a glance to show they also noticed this strange occurrence. They both stood next to each other at the bus stop, in the same position, both staring forward without moving. I couldn't help but stare at them as the bus closed its doors and prepared to pull away. Then suddenly and at the same time, they both slowly turned their heads towards me and stared back at me. I didn't know whether to look away or duck down to hide below the window. I felt slightly relieved when the bus started to pull away, but the two men kept staring back at me as the bus accelerated. The scary thing is, both their faces changed from a blank expression into an almost malevolent evil face with a grinning smile. I was near the back seat and watched out the back window, fearing they would start chasing the bus. They continued to stand there staring back at me with a look like they wanted to kill me. I asked the person next to me if they noticed the two men that just got off the bus, hoping they would validate what I saw. They denied seeing anything strange. I started taking a different bus route after that day, hoping I would never see them again. Thankfully, I never did.
In 1992, as a private soldier serving in the Royal Army Medical Corps, I was transferred to a new unit, 1st Armoured Field Ambulance, based at Hohne in Germany. The unit was accommodated in Glyn Hughes Barracks, a former wartime German barracks, quite imposing in appearance, with carved swastikas and other motifs still visible in the sandstone facing, despite numerous attempts to obliterate them by sandblasting. After each such attempt, everything would look smooth for a few months, and then the outline of the decorations would begin to return as though indelibly imprinted on the spirit of the building. Also in the barracks was a wartime mortuary, used in the 1990s as an annex to the quartermaster's stores. Inside there remained a large marble slab, and one of the walls was decorated with a glorious Aryan warrior, proclaiming it was better to have died for the fatherland than lived a coward, or some such phrase. The atmosphere within the camp was one of all-pervading gloom. Morale among the troops was low, and it was generally considered to be one of the worst postings you could get. Just prior to my arrival, a group of soldiers had been killed in a road accident, and during my fortunately brief stay, there was one accidental shooting, another fatal car crash, and an officer was killed when he fell from the roof of the nearby mess. The site of Belsen concentration camp was a short walk away, and it was widely accepted that Glyn Hughes Barracks, named after the first medical officer to arrive at the liberated Belsen, had housed the camp's SS guards. In such circumstances, it was hardly surprising that the place had a spine-tingling, spooky feel to it, but I was unaware of all this when I arrived from the UK. It turned out that I knew a couple of the lads from training and was billeted in a room with one of them, a clerk known as Indy. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, I was woken by shouting. I recognized the language as German, but at the time, my linguistic skills were limited to ordering a beer and Achtung, Spitfire, etc. I leapt out of bed as the speaker appeared to be in the room and hit the light switch. Instant silence, and, predictably, no one in the room apart from myself and my sleeping roomie. It had seemed so real, but I chalked it up to dreaming and went back to sleep. The next morning I mentioned my dream to Indy, who replied, "Get used to it. We all get it." I don't know how, but I did get used to it. It became commonplace for newcomers in the unit bar, after a few drinks to loosen their tongues, to confess to hearing German voices during the night, or less often, but rather more chilling, the sound of children crying. Generally, it wasn't spoken about, and when it was, you could see the fear in the faces of those who had experienced it. There were a couple of wages on offer. To spend the night locked in the old mortuary carried a hefty reward of 1,000 Deutschmark, and up until the day the barracks was closed and returned to the German authorities, no one ever claimed it. Dutch courage would lead to boasts of how a few were going to sit in the vast cellars beneath the camp and use a Ouija board, but again, no one ever actually carried out the deed. At night, the camp sentries would sprint through the cellars on their rounds, not even stopping for an illicit cigarette. Around 6 years later, while serving in Colchester, I was in conversation with an old and bold sergeant, and while listing previous units, he mentioned he'd served in Hohne. I hadn't thought about the place in years, and had never related my experiences to anyone in the new unit. I asked him if anything strange had ever happened to him there. He told me that on his first night he'd been woken by voices, and in the gloom had seen a figure wearing the distinctive German coal scuttle helmet. He reached for the light switch and the figure vanished. It transpired that we'd both lived in the same room.
On Saturday, the 9th of June 2007, my wife and I were first out of St Joseph's Parish Church in Worksop, Nottinghamshire, because we were in a terrific rush. Mass started at 6 p.m. and finished at 7 p.m, but my wife, a nurse, starts work at 8 p.m. In the intervening hour, we have to cook and eat, take the dogs for a walk, get changed, and in her case, drive to work. It was hot and oppressive. In our haste, we failed to acknowledge various friends, who on reflection were staring at us dumbly. But no problem, we would see them the following week. It struck me that everyone was a bit, slow. Or was it me who was in such a rush? We got into the car, I started the engine, and turned into Wessex Road to do a U-turn in the mouth of the road. Halfway through my U-turn, some fellow turned up and stopped at the junction. I waited for him to move on, and waited, and waited. Why didn't he move? No one was coming. The road was clear. I looked at him. He was frozen with his mouth open. Everyone else was frozen too. A man with a black Labrador stood ramrod straight. His dog, also frozen, had a stick clamped in its jaws. Everyone and everything was motionless, except my wife and me. I just whipped around everything and drove away. "What's up with people?" my wife remarked. "They'd move fast enough if they had to be at work in half an hour." I looked in my mirror and everyone was moving again. It was uncomfortably hot and quiet. I don't even recall birds singing, nothing. It all seemed kind of muffled, distant. I'm not claiming that time stood still, but I do know that for well over a minute everyone in the vicinity looked as if they'd been deep frozen, then snapped out of it and carried on with whatever they were doing. I had this horrible sensation that only I knew what was going on, as if a freeze ray had beamed down on everyone but missed me. I'm glad my wife commented, as this showed it wasn't a soulless hallucination, heat stroke or whatever. It's never happened before and not since.
As well as being my birthday, 23rd August had a special significance for me in 1971. I was serving with the Royal Air Force in Malta, and most of my spare time was devoted to the excellent diving club, run strictly to British subaquatic rules. I was one of 4 instructors in the club of about 140 members, and my immediate boss was an experienced diving officer called John, known affectionately as the Old Man of the Sea. An expedition was planned for a 6-week period to explore the coast around Gozo, a small island off the coast. One of the sites chosen was a small inlet in Exlendi Bay, searching for Punic and Roman wrecks. The initial dive on the site by myself and another instructor called Bob revealed that we would be diving at depths often in excess of 130 feet. As there was no decompression chamber on Gozo, strict diving procedures would have to be followed. We were testing out an Italian decompression meter, which John thought was unreliable. The descent to 130 feet was uneventful, and all was going to plan when Bob's demand valve started acting up, restricting his intake of air. Against all the rules, he indicated to me to stay down while he surfaced and sent down the standby diver to keep me company. I swam around for a while looking for anything of interest on the rocky ocean floor. I saw a light ahead of me and was drawn to it both by curiosity and by what seemed to be an unknown force. Over the next ridge and much further down, I saw a very beautiful young woman, tall and slim, with a lovely figure, standing at the entrance to a large cave. She was dressed in what looked like a white Indian sari. She wore sandals, her hair was plaited, and her wrists were adorned with various bracelets. The incandescence of the surrounding area added to the serenity and calm of the sight before me. I thought that I must be suffering from the narcs, nitrogen narcosis, described in the early days of diving as the rapture of the deep, a feeling of euphoria, closely resembling drunkenness. As a very experienced instructor with more than 200 deep dives under my belt, I realized that I was in deep trouble, deep being the operative word. A look at my depth gauge revealed that I was 230 feet down. The Italian decompression meter strapped to my wrist had long since given up as it was full of water. Fascination at what I saw overruled my training and my immediate need for an ascent and decompression procedures. Then she spoke.
I have been waiting for you. Do not be afraid, I mean you no harm. With me you are safe.
I backed away, but she smiled, walked towards me and held out her hand. It felt warm, sensual and safe, and my fear disappeared.
When you return to me, I will be waiting for you. Then you will stay with me forever. I have a gift for you.
She handed me a small jar about 13 centimeters tall, shaped like an amphora, which I took from her with my other hand.
Now you must go. You will always be safe for your return to me.
As I ascended, I saw her waving as she slowly faded from view into the azure depth. After a very long decompression stop aided by a spare set of air cylinders, it was explanation time. The needle on the depth gauge registered 235 feet. Faulty gauge, said John, because if it isn't, you are in a lot of trouble. With that sort of depth on the clock, you had better stay within camp area and keep someone with you in case of any bends problem. About 1 week later, I was summoned by John, who told me that the depth gauge had been tested and was completely accurate and serviceable, making my dive the longest and deepest in club history. Why I did not get the bends was a mystery to him. He also told me that Mr. Malia, the curator of the archaeological section of the Malta National Museum, had identified the jar I had retrieved as a Phoenician scent jar of about 2000 BC, used by the royal ladies of that time. The mystery was that its contents still smelled fresh, the potter's stamp on the side of the handle was crystal clear, and the jar was described in the report as being in mint condition. John was curious where I had got it. I said, "You wouldn't believe me if I told you."
Around 2:30 or so one morning 11 years ago, when I was around 15 years old, I put down the book I was reading, got under the covers, and switched off my reading light. As I was setting down my glasses on the bedside table, I noticed that my room had become very warm, almost oppressively so. I felt very uncomfortable and vulnerable, so I reached for my glasses again. The lenses were fogged, and I used my pillowcase to wipe off the condensation. I looked around but saw nothing unusual, so I kicked off the covers and began to relax. After about maybe 30 seconds, I heard a vibration, fast and buzzing like a muted cell phone. The volume increased at least tenfold and was joined by an almost metallic-sounding whine. The vibration was so loud the glass in my bedroom window was shaking violently, almost to the point where I felt it would shatter. An enormous pressure began to build around me, as if I were on a roller coaster, and the fillings in my two back teeth started to get very hot. Then, to my horror, the air to the right of my bed expanded like a soap bubble being blown and revealed a tall, completely white figure that was very thin, almost two-dimensional, and featureless. The figure pushed violently against the air around the soap bubble as if it were pushing through a balloon and distorted the air like a funhouse mirror. At this point, I tried to scream, but the vibration completely drowned out any noise I tried to make. The figure then started whipping and thrashing harder than ever, and the pressure around me increased so much that I started to get blurred vision. After a short time, I don't know how long for sure as there wasn't a clock in my line of sight, I lost consciousness. When I awoke at around 3:30 a.m., my pillow and bedclothes were soaked with blood from my nose, and I had a horrible headache from the back of my eyes to the top of my head. I went into my mother's room to tell her that I didn't feel good. My mother, who was awake, took one look at all the blood on me and immediately made my stepfather drive me to the hospital. On the way, I asked her why she was awake. She wouldn't give me a straight answer, but mentioned something about a loud noise. She was recovering from a stroke at the time, so it was hard for her to describe things. My stepfather was visibly shaken and wouldn't look me in the eyes when I described what happened. We arrived at the hospital and they gave me a CAT scan and other tests. The doctor kept asking me if we had flown on a plane or been anywhere with high elevation within the last day or so, which of course we hadn't. I was sent home with some mild pain relievers and a clean bill of health. After that night, I had trouble sleeping, always fearful it would happen to me again.